Today is January 22nd, year of our Savior Jesus Christ, 2023. And the title of this video is a continuation of Revelation chapters 8 and chapters 9. The title of this video is going to be Revelation chapter 9, B as in Bravo. So continuing, we're looking at what's going on with what was going on with the Arabs, right? And what they were doing. And how foolish the Roman empires were, whether of the West or the East. They were so full of themselves. They allowed the Arabs to come in and take over the breadbasket of their empire, which was in Egypt. Very foolish. Of course, you know what happened. That was the last straw. The people of North Africa invited the Arabs to come in and to give them some semblance of a reasonable government. All right? So you see, the Roman army could never set foot again. In 711, we find, I already read a lot of this, but what's interesting is that they were invading Gaul, or modern-day France, and Charles Martel finally defeated them at Tours, and they fled back into Spain. After that, they never tried north of the Pyrenees Mountains. Hence, the whole southeasterly third of the Roman Empire had been lost to the Saracens. They had all the African and Asian territories of the Eastern Empire. The so-called Eastern Roman Empire at that time had only a very small district around Constantinople. All the rest was in Arab hands. Then a new dynasty came up to power among the Arabs, and they moved the capital of the Arab Empire, which had been at Damascus in Syria. They moved it east to Baghdad in 762 AD. Interesting, Baghdad, Iraq, Babylon.
Yep.
And in the 800s and 900s, this Saracen Empire simply fell apart and broke up into a multitude of petty kingdoms. You remember some peculiar things that were mentioned here. It was commanded that they should not hurt the grass of the earth, neither any trees. Now you will remember in Revelation 8, verse 7, it was noted that the Germanic tribes, when they invaded, caused tremendous devastation. They really broke things up, chopped down trees, burnt cities, and a lot of that sort of thing.
Even when Attila the Hun said, once I go through, even where I've been, even the grass won't grow anymore.
Yeah. But now the Mohammedans were very definitely commanded in the Quran that they were not to try and make a devastated, worthless land. They were to try and conquer it, turn the inhabitants into Mohammedans, and then they wanted these Mohammedan inhabitants to be a prosperous people. Therefore, they would do nothing to destroy trees and crops that they followed. Revelation 9, verse 4. What is Revelation 9, verse 4?
It was commanded them that they should not hurt the grass of the earth, neither any green thing, neither any tree, but only those men which have not the seal of God in their foreheads.
Interestingly, Muhammad gave orders to his men and the caliphs who succeeded him to follow the same policy. They were out to destroy a corrupt church. Therefore, Muhammad said that those who were living in monasteries, those who felt they could best serve their God by retiring to a poor and humble and hard-working life in monasteries, were not to be disturbed, but that the priests in these wealthy city churches were to be simply killed without any question of converting them. And he said, just split their skulls. Thus, whenever Mohammedans conquered a city, they offered the people three choices: be converted to Mohammedanism, in case they would be received as brothers and equals. If they were not willing to give up their religion, they were allowed to continue their more or less Christian worship upon paying a heavy tribute tax, and recognize the fact that they were a defeated and conquered people. If they wouldn't do either one, they were killed. Lacking an ethical obligation, a totally corrupt church inspired few martyrs.
Oh yeah, we'll be Muslim.
Yeah, so you got all these Roman Catholics going, oh yeah, praise
Allah.
Yeah. Instead of holding out, practically all of them paid the tribute tax. Some accepted Mohammedanism, the rest paid tribute tax. as it said in Revelation, they kind of wished for strength of character to fight to the death as martyrs, but they didn't. Death fled from them. Thus, the great bulk of them paid the tribute tax to the Arabs and got along that way. It is said of these locusts that came out of the smoke, have you ever, by the way, taken a good look at a grasshopper or a picture of a grasshopper? And notice that their heads do have a surprisingly horse head look to them. And on their heads were crowns, not of gold, but crowns like gold. A yellow turban was a very common article of clothing among Arab warriors. So the yellow made these turbans look at a distance like gold. They had hair like hair of a woman, and many of these Arabs did let their hair grow long. And he said they had breastplates of iron. The Greeks apparently originated the systematic use of heavy breast and back plates of iron, but the Arabs invented a new type of iron. Now, a man in the Grecian armor was like a crab in a shell, and he was just about as clumsy, too, weighted down with that. On horseback, it could be a considerable burden and interference. So the Arabs invented chain armor, a perfectly flexible jacket of chain links. You take it off and drop it on the ground, and it would just slump like a wet fish net. But when it was on, just the same, these iron chain links prevented a sword or a spear point or an arrow point from penetrating enough to do any damage. So the Arabs were largely armed with this chain armor. Then it says they had power to hurt 5 months, men 5 months. Of course, you know the biblical prophetic scale of a year for a day, and that prophetic month or 30 days equaled 30 years. Therefore, 5 months would be 150 years. Well, in 612 AD, Muhammad first proclaimed his mission to convert all the infidels. So the 10 years from then until 1622, he was trying to make converts by preaching, and he did make some 40 converts before he was driven out of Mecca. But in 612 AD, he started preaching Mohammedanism. Exactly 150 years later, in 762, the new capital of the Saracen Empire was established in Baghdad, and no further attempts were made to spread their power westward. But the Arabs didn't all pack up and go home. They stayed in Egypt, in North Africa, Palestine, and Syria. It is important, therefore, to comprehend that the aggressive spread of their power lasted exactly the prophetic 5 months or 150 years. Remember now, this was written by John no later than 96 AD, and you will note the surprising accuracy in these many points of this prophecy. The events that were pictured on the blowing of the fifth trumpet made up the first of these 3 woes. Then you come to the second woe, which is described in Revelation chapter 19, verses 13 to 21. Revelation 19, verses 13 to 21. Let Stephen talk for a little bit.
And he was clothed with a vesture dipped in blood, and his name is called the Word of God. And the armies which were in heaven followed him upon white horses, clothed in fine linen, white and
Revelation 9, verses 13 to 21. Wow, that's on me. Revelation 9, verses 13 to 21.
And the sixth angel sounded, and I heard a voice from the 4 horns of the golden altar, which is before God, saying to the sixth angel which had the trumpet, loose the 4 angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates. And the 4 angels were loosed, which were prepared for an hour, and a day, and a month, and a year, for to slay the 1/3 part of men. And the number of the army of the horsemen were 200,000. And I heard the number of them. And thus I saw the horses in a vision, and them that sat on them, having breastplates of fire, and adjacent and brimstone, and the heads of the horses were as the heads of lions. And out of their mouths issued fire and smoke and brimstone. By these 3 were 1/3 part of men killed by the fire and by the smoke and by the brimstone which issued out of their mouths. For their power is in their mouth and in their tails, and their tails were like unto serpents and had heads, and with them they do hurt. Then the rest of the men were not killed by these plagues, yet repented not of the works of their hands. that they should not worship devils and idols of gold and silver and brass and stone and of wood, which neither can see nor hear nor walk. Neither repented they of their murders, nor of their sorceries, nor of their fornication, nor of their thefts.
Sounds like America today, isn't it?
Yep.
Now, you notice that in verse 17, it talks about brimstone is the old name for sulfur, ladies and gentlemen. So this second woe was the Turkish invasion during the 11th century. The first portion of the Turks, the Seljuk Turks, appeared. They settled near the Aral Sea by the east end of the Mediterranean Sea. They were converted to Mohammedanism in 1062 AD. They crossed the Euphrates River, moving into the old territory of the Eastern Roman Empire. They covered Mesopotamia, Armenia, Western Turkestan, Persia, and parts of Asia Minor and Syria. They went about 1100 AD, and they break up into many small kingdoms. While they were taking the outlying provinces of the empire, the Seljuk Turks did not get near enough to Constantinople to threaten them. A couple centuries later came the Osmanli Turks. You read about them in your history books under the name the Ottoman Turks. The dynastic founder of this nation was Osman or Osman. Apparently somebody who lists began calling it the Othman. There was an earlier character named Othman, and I suppose they got the name mixed up. Then the ancient and medieval historians and travelers who wrote about the Turks called it the Ottoman. No Turk would answer to that name. They have always said they were the Osmanli people. The corruption of the name Osman or Osman can be verified from the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon, Volume 6, page 335. About 1250 AD, the Osman Turks appeared near the headquarters of the Euphrates River, migrating westward. They settled in the lands of the Seljuk Turk. In the lands of the Seljuk Turk Sultan Aladdin became a vassal and joined his armed forces and adopted his banner, the Crescent. Then in 1288 AD, Osman began to conquer the Eastern Asia Minor lands of the empire. He was rich in wheat, and he found it easy enough to take over. By 1301, he had taken a large area clear to the Black Sea. Osman died in 1326 AD, but his successors continued their expansion. The Turks, even more so than the Romans, were the soldiers par excellence. They were really made a science of warfare. They quickly developed a strategy that worked. Like the Arabs, they were a nomadic horsemen. They relied principally upon cavalry. Warfare before that time had consisted of the main bodies of the two armies rushing against each other and sticking each other with spears and chopping at each other with swords. And they got to it as directly and expeditiously as possible. Sometimes a smaller but better trained and disciplined force routed a larger one. The Turks had a bright idea. They had their best trained and best equipped troops kept as a reserve back at the rear. In the front, they put their light armed irregular cavalry, people who were not primarily soldiers, but simply had gotten into the army for the hope of sharing in the loot if there was victory. These were not well trained, not well disciplined, not very effective, and if they all got killed, the army didn't lose anything significant. Thus, they were put in front and sent out to attack the enemy. Of course, they were beaten off quickly, but they kept coming back again, closing ranks with the enemy. The enemy cavalry would charge them and drive them in headlong flight. That was repeated several times. The enemy cavalry also drove them off without any particular difficulty, but they tired themselves out in doing so. Then, when the horses and men were tired, those irregular cavalry Turks would run off to the side, and the main cavalry body of Turks, rested and fresh, would make a furious charge against the enemy, who were too tired now to keep up the battle. And this strategy brought the Turks victory after victory after victory. For a period of 3 centuries, 300 years, they hardly ever lost a battle. Another thing they developed from about 330 AD was that they kept a standing army. Up to that time, in all the kingdoms, when wars came, all the able-bodied men of military age were subject to being drafted into the armed forces. But they were made up of principally of farmers, merchants, or workmen. Therefore, they didn't have very much practice at military arts, and they weren't especially skilled at it. But the Turks, from about 1330 on, raised a considerable sized army of professional soldiers. This was their whole job. They were paid regular salaries for this, and they wasted no time in doing so and doing anything else. Thus, they were constantly in training, practicing warfare, because they were well armed. They were, of course, tremendously effective, and it was very difficult for untrained forces to stand up to them. You can't say much for the Turkish morals or kindness or anything of that sort, but you do have to give them credit for being effective soldiers. Incidentally, during the Korean War, the Turks sent a small contingency of soldiers over there to help us, and they were probably the most effective troops on our side. You notice how Russia shoots down our airplanes and steals our Navy ships and so on. They didn't fire a shot at the Turks, but the Turks would shoot back. Another thing developed at this time, particular to the Turks. You have, I think it was during a time where they were trying to recruit these Turks, and they sent a video about, and they were supposed to be like a paratrooper deal, but it was the wrong video, and it showed all the people dying in parachute jumping out. It aroused these Turkish soldiers so much that they wanted to join and be a part of that.
Because they were all dying when they jumped out.
Yeah, that's exciting.
Not much of a life they didn't care much for life. That's
now,
for sure.
Another thing developed at this time, peculiar to the Turks. You have heard of these troops under the name of Janissaries. Of course, the name Turkish was Yani Sheri, meaning new troops. The Turks had conquered quite a number of Christian towns, and they were wondering what to do. If they let them alone, they might bring rebellion against their rule. Hence, by way of both strengthening the Turkish forces and weakening the conquered, they took 1,000 at least each year of the Christian children, the very cream of the boys of 8 to 12 years old. They were taken by force from their parents, converted to Mohammedanism, and right from the start put under military training, strict discipline, learning to undergo hardship. They became tough and hardy. While it was rough going and strict discipline, on the other hand, the pay was good, and promotion came quickly to one who really put his mind to it and showed the making of a good soldier. Thus, they relied upon these Janissaries as among their picked troops. You notice that these white Christian Israelites, battle axe and weapons of war, once they got in this military training, they rose to the top. They became the most elite within the Turkish Empire, within the Turkish army. Interesting. Thus, they relied upon these Janissaries as among their picked troops. They believed it was their duty to convert all unbelievers to Mohammedanism. The time period of these Janissary troops continued for 3 centuries. It has been estimated that a full 500,000 Christian children were thus kidnapped and made into Turkish soldiers. The Arabs had moved out to conquer lands primarily for the purpose of converting the conquered to Mohammedanism. They, of course, followed the custom of all armies in doing a certain amount of looting when they captured a place. And that is not entirely ancient. Talk to anybody who was in the American army that invaded Germany and see the cameras and binoculars and such things that he stole from the inhabitants when he was there. Hence, these aren't customs of the ancient past alone. Now, the Turks, while they were Mohammeds, were not primarily interested in the spread of the Mohammed religion. They were primarily interested in conquering and ruling these other lands. They wanted to be the masters, supporting themselves simply by fighting and on the tribute taxes that they could collect. The Arabs, by their tremendously effective armed forces, did succeed in spreading their dominion, but they did very little about organizing it into an effective kingdom. The Turks, on the other hand, instead of trying to see how fast they could spread out, they would move over 50 to 100 miles, taking that much new territory, and then for 20 or 30 years, they would stop there while they completed the consolidation of their conquest, making the territory thoroughly organized and making sure everybody knew just who was boss now in these now conquered lands. They were out to rule. In 1356 AD, the Turks gained their first foothold on the European soil, landing first at Gallipoli. Gallipoli. The main portion of the city of Constantinople is on the eastern side. The portion of the Turkish side is called Scutari. Asia Minor was pretty largely in the hands of the Turks, and now they had moved over on to the European side. In 1361, they captured the quite important city of Adrianople, and that finally brought some alarm in Constantinople. I guess we got a problem. As far as regarding their provinces, from the Turks was concerned, they never gave it a thought. They knew it was hopeless. They could not regain them from the Arabs. So as far as that goes, they were a beaten people, contented to live within their city of Constantinople, just hoping they would be left at peace as in their former empire. Thus, from 1361 AD, when the Turks captured Adrianople, the emperors at Constantinople lived in utter dread of the Turks and were always very conciliatory in trying to enter into treaties with the Turks, but by which they could guarantee that the Turks would not tax Constantinople. You remember there had been a split 1,000 years earlier between the Roman Catholic Church and the Greek Orthodox Church. Nevertheless, Constantinople, while it was the seat of the Greek Orthodox Church, had lost their outlying empire. They were in danger of losing the city they had left, and they did not have enough military strength to defend themselves effectively. They could not hope for rescue by any Asiatic power. The only hope was from the Christian nations of Europe. The period of the Crusades was past. Christian nations had spent a great deal of money and lost a great many lives in the Crusades. They were not in the mood to renew it, particularly because all these European Christian nations were in a period of general internal disorder about this time. The one factor that might help to induce the European nations to go on a new crusade and send forth forces to defend Constantinople would be if the Pope could stir them up to do it. Thus, the emperor kept intriguing, trying to gain the support of the Pope. He became very subservient to the Pope, where before there had been no love lost at all. By this, as it became known, the emperor lost the support of the Greek portion of his population, who were very much attached to their church, corrupt as it was. And in fact, the patriarch of the Greek Orthodox Church at this time said, "I would rather see the Turks in Constantinople than to see the Pope's power restored here."
Wow.
End quote.
Wow. They'd rather give it to the than to give it over to the Pope.
Yeah.
Amazing. That just shows you how bad they were, how bad the Pope was to them.
Yeah. So they were really in a rather bad way. The Turks, meantime, were vigorously pushing their conquest on into the Balkan countries. In 1389, they absorbed Bulgaria. They brought their frontier to the Danube. Serbia became a vassal state. They had no part in the Turkish governors, but the king of Serbia had to swear allegiance to them in that he would raise an army and fight with them, that is, on the Turkish side in time of war. As a matter of fact, the rest of his life he did so and furnished them with very effective troops. In 1394 AD, they finally managed to get together a very minor sort of crusade. About 12,000 knights, some 8,000 of them from France, and the remainder from Germany and Hungary, marched down to the Danube to fight the Turks and drive them back out of Europe. War was definitely a business with the Turks, and they were thoroughly businesslike. But these knights were vain, arrogant, boastful, and stupid. They said, "Why? These Turks are no match for us." One of them boasted that if the sky fell, we'd hold it up on the points of our lances, end quote. Thus, when they got to the point where it was probably only going to be a day or two's march to make contact with the Turkish forces, they stopped in what seemed like a favorable place to meet the Turks, there beside the Danube. Instead of making proper preparations and fortifying the place, they just spent their time in riotous drinking and carousing until suddenly they were aroused by scouts coming back with the word that the Turks were just over the hill in the next valley. The whole Turkish army coming. They formed up in lines for battle. The king of Hungary was a sensible man, and he wanted to do this in a reasonable and sensible way. But these French knights were so vain and boastful and arrogant, they were not about to be told how they were going to fight. They wanted to go out and just mop up these Turks like that. Then these 8,000 French knights attacked the Turkish army of 40,000. The Turks were drawn up in their typical way. On the far side of the hill over the next valley was the main body of Turks out in front of them. In front of them, they put this light irregular cavalry. Then the French knights charged them, and they had a grand time defeating and driving them into flight. They got themselves thoroughly tired and their horses tired out. They chased the retreating Turkish light cavalry up over the hill, and just beyond them lay the main body of the Turkish army. The Turkish forces had been drawn in more or less of a crescent form. Immediately, these two wings rushed out, attacking the French on the flanks and closing back on them so they could not retreat. Practically all the French knights were either killed on the field of the day or captured. What arrogance you get.
Yeah.
What arrogance. But ladies and gentlemen, this is all about Revelation and history. We're going to pick it up next time. God bless you. Remember, come to Jesus Christ. There's no hope outside Him and His living Word. Thank you.